If something begs you not to touch it, maybe that's exactly when you should, Ethan Cole would later say. But at 3:17 a.m., inside a containment wing that smelled like ozone and overheated circuits, he wasn't thinking about philosophy. He was thinking about a system failure blinking red across his visor and a contract that paid by the hour. The alarms pulsed in steady intervals, low and mechanical. As he stepped through the sealed corridor, boots echoing against metal flooring cooled to just above freezing, his breath faint in the air, each exhale caught in the pale blue emergency lights. The panel on Unit 7 flickered, readings unstable, energy containment fluctuating in irregular waves that didn't match any known biological pattern, and Ethan frowned, tapping the side of his wrist display as numbers refused to settle, because machines broke in predictable ways. And this wasn't predictable. The door hissed open with reluctance, like it didn't want him to look inside, and for a moment he thought the chamber was empty, just a sphere of suspended light drifting in silence, soft and almost alive. Then it shifted, and the shape inside resolved into a figure. No, a woman, held in place by bands of glowing restraint that pulsed in time with the failing field. Her skin wasn't skin, not exactly. It shimmered like reflected moonlight on water, faint blue with threads of silver moving beneath the surface as if light itself was trying to escape. And where the restraints touched her, that light dimmed, uneven, like something struggling to breathe. Ethan stopped at the threshold, one hand still resting on the door frame, the hum of the failing generator vibrating through his fingertips, and for a second, he forgot the manual, forgot the warnings stamped in bold letters across every briefing file, because none of those reports had mentioned her. The display on the wall labeled her as Asset 7, nothing more, just a designation, a line item in a system that treated anomalies like inventory. But as her head tilted slightly toward him, eyes opening, slow, deliberate, he felt the label collapse into something meaningless. Her gaze wasn't hostile, wasn't even afraid. It was searching, like she was trying to understand why he was there, why anyone would be. The restraints tightened for a fraction of a second, reacting to the fluctuation, and a soft sound escaped her, not quite a voice, more like a breath catching between worlds. And Ethan's jaw tightened as his diagnostic feed spiked with warnings. Containment integrity at 62% and dropping. Protocol said to stabilize the field, increase power, reinforce the cage, but his eyes stayed on. The way her light flickered unevenly, like a heartbeat out of rhythm. Systems glitching. He muttered under his breath, though he knew that wasn't true. Not really, because systems didn't hesitate. And whatever this was, it felt like hesitation. He stepped forward anyway, boots crossing the threshold into the chamber, the temperature dropping another 10 degrees as the field reacted to his presence. And the bands of light constricted slightly, not enough to harm, just enough to remind him that he wasn't supposed to be here. His gloved hand hovered over the nearest control panel, fingers inches from the override switch, and for the first time in a long while, Ethan Cole didn't move immediately, didn't follow the procedure etched into muscle memory. Because the specimen was looking directly at him now, and in that gaze, there was no calculation, no threat assessment, just a quiet, impossible question. Don't, she whispered, the word barely audible, like it had traveled a long way to reach him, and his hand paused midair, the alarm still counting down something he didn't yet understand, while the light around her dimmed just a fraction more, waiting. The alarm shifted pitch, sharper now, like the facility itself was losing patience, and Ethan Cole realized the system was not counting down a failure. It was preparing a response. His hand stayed suspended inches from the override as the word echoed in his head. Do not as a command, but as a warning that felt older than the machinery around them. The display beside him flashed containment integrity at 58%, then 56%, numbers dropping in uneven steps that made no mechanical sense, and he exhaled. Slowly, steadying his breath the way he did when working on unstable reactors back on Mars, because panic never fixed anything, but attention sometimes did. He lowered his hand, not to activate the reinforcement protocol, but to reroute power away from the outer field, a small adjustment, barely enough to register on the system logs. Yet the effect was immediate. The bands of light around her flickered, not tightening this time, but loosening by a fraction of an inch. Her shoulders dropped. Subtle, almost imperceptible, but Ethan noticed, because he was looking for signs of failure and found relief instead. The hum in the room changed tone, less aggressive, more like a breath being released, and he swallowed, glancing at the diagnostics again, knowing full well he was not following any approved procedure. "You are not supposed to do that," she said, her voice clearer now, still soft, but carrying a resonance that did not belong to the air alone, and he gave a small shrug, eyes still on the panel as he adjusted a second control, redirecting excess energy into a buffer coil that had not been used in years. "Yeah," he replied quietly. "I get that a lot." And there was no humor in it, just a simple statement of fact. The restraints dimmed another degree, their glow less harsh against her skin, and for the first time since he had entered the chamber, the light beneath her surface began to move more evenly, like something finding its rhythm again. He stepped closer without thinking, boots crossing the last few feet until he stood just outside the reach of the containment field, close enough to see the fine details now. The way the silver threads beneath her skin traced patterns that did not repeat, like constellations shifting in real time. "What are you?" he asked, not because the file did not tell him, but because it clearly had not told him enough. Her eyes followed him, steady, unblinking, and for a moment she did not answer, as if the question itself was unfamiliar. Then she tilted her head slightly, considering him in a way that made the room feel very small. "I was something they feared," she said at last, each word measured, "and something they tried to own." And Ethan felt that land heavier than any technical readout, because he had seen that pattern before, not in gods or anomalies, but in contracts and corporations, and the way people labeled anything they did not understand as a problem to be managed. The system chimed again, a warning this time, automated voice announcing that external security protocols were initializing, and he knew that meant he was running out of time, that someone else would be here soon, someone who would not hesitate the way he was hesitating now. He looked back at the control panel, then at the restraints, then at her, and made a decision that did not feel like a decision so much as a continuation of the one he had already started. His fingers moved across the interface, bypassing two safeguards and isolating the primary lock sequence, the one control that would release the first band completely. "If I shut this down," he said, voice low, steady despite the rising alarms, "does it help you, or does it make things worse?" And she held his gaze, something unreadable passing through her eyes, something that might have been caution or might have been hope. "It changes everything," she answered, and for reasons he could not explain. That was enough. Ethan pressed the override, and the first restraint dissolved into drifting light. The moment the first restraint dissolved, the entire chamber exhaled as if something ancient had been holding its breath, and Ethan felt it in his chest before he saw it on the monitors. Energy readings stabilizing in a pattern that looked less like containment and more like recovery. The remaining bands of light flickered in response, not tightening but hesitating, as though they were no longer certain of their purpose. And the woman in front of him lowered her head slightly, not in weakness, but in focus, her eyes closing for a brief second as the silver threads beneath her skin began to move with quiet precision. The alarms outside the chamber escalated, a second layer now, sharper, closer, the kind that meant human footsteps would not be far behind. And Ethan knew he had maybe 60 seconds before this became something he could not explain away with a maintenance report. "You should stop," she said softly, her voice steadier now, carrying a weight that did not belong to the failing systems around them. And he glanced at her, brow tightening just a fraction as his fingers hovered over the next control. "That is usually when I keep going," he replied, not looking for approval, just stating the truth the way he understood it. The panel pulsed under his touch, warning icons stacking one over another as he isolated the second restraint, bypassing a lock that required two separate authorizations, neither of which he had. And for a moment the system resisted, a low hum building in the walls like pressure behind a dam. But then the circuit rerouted, imperfect, improvised, human, and the second band unraveled into strands of fading light. She inhaled, deeper this time, a sound that carried through the chamber like wind moving across open space, and Ethan felt the temperature shift, not colder, not warmer, just different, as if the room itself had adjusted to her presence rather than the other way around. They believed they were containing me, she said, opening her eyes again, the glow within them brighter now, more defined. But they were only interrupting something they did not understand. And Ethan almost smiled at that, because it sounded familiar, like every broken system he had ever been hired to fix. The third restraint remained, brighter than the others, anchored at her core, and his display warned him that removing it would trigger a full shutdown of the containment grid, followed by a cascade he could not predict. And for the first time since he walked in, he hesitated, not because he was afraid, but because he finally understood that this was not just a repair, this was a choice with no undo. Footsteps echoed faintly in the corridor now, distant but approaching, the rhythm unmistakable, and he exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders as if preparing to lift something heavy. "If I leave that one," he said, nodding toward the final band, "do you stay like this?" And she looked down at it, the light pulsing weakly where it intersected her form, then back at him, her expression unreadable but her voice certain. "I remain diminished," she said, "and you remain safe." And that word lingered in the air between them. Safe, like it was supposed to matter more than anything else. Ethan studied her for a long second, the alarms, the footsteps, the flashing warnings all fading into background noise as he focused on the simple equation in front of him, a system failing and something alive inside it. He reached out, not to the panel this time, but toward the edge of the containment field itself, his gloved hand stopping, just short of the shimmering boundary, and for a fraction of a second, he felt something reach back, not touching, just acknowledging, like two sides of the same problem recognizing each other. "I am not great at safe," he said quietly, and then he turned, fingers moving with deliberate precision across the control interface as he initiated the final override, the system protesting, lights dimming, power rerouting in chaotic lines across his display, while the last restraint began to fracture into pieces of drifting brilliance, and the chamber filled with a silence that felt louder than any alarm. The final restraint did not break all at once. It unraveled slowly, like something that had held for too long and no longer knew how to let go, threads of light drifting upward and dissolving into the air as the containment grid collapsed into silence. For a brief second, nothing moved, not the alarms, not the system displays, not even Ethan, because the absence of resistance felt heavier than the struggle that came before it. Then she stepped forward, not falling, not staggering, simply stepping, as if gravity had been waiting for her permission all along, and the space she occupied seemed to adjust around her, the dim emergency lights bending subtly, reflecting off her skin in a way that made the room feel larger than its physical dimensions. Ethan took half a step back without thinking, not out of fear, but because something instinctive told him he was no longer standing inside a machine. He was standing inside a moment that did not belong to machines at all, the alarms. Outside, the chamber cut off abruptly, replaced by a low, uncertain hum, as if the entire facility was recalculating what it was supposed to be doing. She looked at her hands, turning them slowly, watching the silver threads beneath her skin settle into a steady, luminous rhythm, and when she exhaled this time, the sound carried farther, softer, like wind passing through an open field rather than a sealed room. "You should have left," she said, not as a warning now, but as an observation, her voice calm, almost curious, and Ethan let out a quiet breath he had not realized he was holding, glancing at the dead panel beside him where warnings had once crowded the screen. "Yeah," he said, "that was probably the smarter move," and there was a faint trace of humor in it, though his eyes stayed on her, tracking every shift in light, every subtle change in the way the room responded to her presence. The corridor beyond the chamber door remained closed, but he could hear movement now, voices muffled, controlled, the kind of coordination that meant people were trying to understand a situation that no longer fit their models. She took another step closer, and the air between them felt charged, not with danger, but with something unmeasured, something that did not register on any sensor he carried. And yet he was aware of it in the same way he was aware of his own heartbeat. "You altered the pattern," she said, meeting his gaze again. And this time there was something new there, not confusion, not distance, but recognition, not with force, not with command, but with choice. And Ethan frowned slightly, shifting his weight as if the floor itself had become less certain. I fixed what was broken, he replied, because that was the only framework he had, the only language that made sense to him. And she considered that, the faintest curve touching her expression as if the idea itself was both simple and profound. No, she said gently. You saw something that was not meant to be fixed, and you changed it anyway. And the words settled in the space between them, quiet, but undeniable. The chamber lights flickered once, then stabilized, no longer emergency blue, but a soft neutral glow. And for the first time since he entered, Ethan could see the room clearly without distortion. Without interference, just metal, glass, and a woman standing where no one had expected her to stand. He rubbed a hand across the back of his neck, a familiar gesture grounding him in something human, something ordinary, even as everything else felt anything but ordinary. So what happens now? He asked, not as a challenge, not even as a question he expected to be answered, but because the moment demanded something, and silence, for once, felt incomplete. She looked past him, toward the sealed door, toward the world beyond the chamber that was already shifting in response to what had just occurred, and then back at him, her eyes steady, luminous, and impossibly calm. Now, she said, they will try to understand what you have done, and she paused, just long enough for the weight of that to settle, and they will fail. And for reasons he could not fully explain, Ethan believed her. The silence did not last. It never did, and Ethan felt it break before he heard it. A subtle shift in the air pressure as the sealed door behind him unlocked with a soft mechanical click that sounded far too calm for what was about to follow. He did not turn immediately, his attention still on her, on the way the light beneath her skin had settled into something steady and intentional, no longer flickering, no longer struggling, just present. And for a moment he wondered if the rest of the world would ever feel as simple as this again. They are coming, she said, not looking at the door, not needing to, and Ethan finally glanced over his shoulder as the panel slid open a few inches, stopping as if uncertain, as if even the system that controlled it was hesitating. Voices filtered through the gap, controlled, measured, the kind of tone people used when they were trying to contain something they did not fully understand, and he recognized it immediately, the same tone supervisors used when a system failed in a way that made them nervous. He turned back to her, rubbing his hands together once as if shaking off the last of the cold, though the temperature in the room had begun to normalize. I am guessing you have a plan, he said quietly, because standing between a released anomaly and a group of trained responders was not exactly covered in his job description. She tilted her head slightly, considering him again, that same calm curiosity returning, and for a second he got the strange impression that she was not evaluating the situation, she was evaluating him. I do not plan the way you do, she replied, her voice even, carrying that same layered resonance that seemed to exist just beyond the audible. But I understand patterns. And her gaze shifted, not to the door, but to the walls, the floor, the ceiling, as if the entire facility were something she could read rather than simply occupy. The door slid open a little farther, enough now that a figure could be seen beyond it, a silhouette framed by the corridor lights, motionless for a second before taking a cautious step forward, and Ethan felt his shoulders tighten instinctively, not out of fear, but out of habit, the reflex of someone who had spent too long in places where uncertainty came with consequences. You should go, he said under his breath, not as an order, not even as a suggestion he expected her to follow, just something that felt necessary to say. She looked back at him, and this time there was no distance in her expression at all, just a quiet clarity that made his chest feel unexpectedly tight. You assume I am the one in danger, she said, and there was no arrogance in it, just a simple statement that did not need to prove itself. The figure at the door paused, and Ethan could see the hesitation even from where he stood, the slight shift of weight, the way the person did not cross the threshold, as if something inside the room was holding them back without ever touching them. The lights overhead flickered once, then steadied, and the low hum that had replaced the alarms deepened, not louder, but fuller, like a system finding a new baseline. Ethan took a small step to the side, not blocking the doorway, not shielding her, just repositioning himself in a way that made space for whatever came next. And he realized in that moment that he was no longer thinking in terms of protocols or outcomes. He was simply present, reacting to what was in front of him. "Then what do you do?" he asked, his voice quieter now, less certain than before. And she turned slightly, her attention shifting fully to the open doorway, to the world that had contained her only minutes ago. For a heartbeat, nothing happened, no movement, no surge of energy, no dramatic change, just stillness. And then she took a single step forward, not toward escape, not toward confrontation, but toward the threshold itself. The place where inside and outside met, where definitions blurred. The figure in the corridor did not retreat, but they did not advance either, caught in that same moment of uncertainty. And Ethan watched as she stopped just short of the doorway, her presence filling the space in a way that had nothing to do with size or force. "I show them," she said softly, almost to herself, and the words carried a quiet weight that settled over the room like a promise. Ethan did not know what she meant, not yet. But as the light around her shifted, not brighter, not harsher, just clearer, he had the distinct feeling that whatever came next was not something they were prepared to measure. The corridor light did not spill into the chamber the way it should have. It bent at the threshold, softening as it reached her, as if even illumination adjusted its behavior in her presence. And Ethan noticed it before anyone else did, because he had spent years watching systems behave the way they were designed to. And this was not that. The figure in the doorway hesitated again, one foot forward, one still anchored in the hall. Posture controlled but uncertain, the kind of stillness that came from training colliding with something untrained for. And behind them, more shadows gathered, shapes that stopped short of entering, waiting for a signal that never quite came. She did not raise her voice, did not step further, did not do anything that would register as action on a sensor. And yet the space between her and the doorway filled with a quiet pressure, not force, not resistance, just presence, like standing at the edge of a vast open landscape and realizing how small you were. "In it, you built walls," she said, her tone even, directed not at any one person but at the room itself, at the structure, at the idea of containment, and called it understanding. And the words carried outward, settling into the corridor where they seemed to slow the movement of everyone listening. Ethan stayed where he was, off to the side, not part of the exchange, and yet somehow central to it, his hands relaxed at his sides, his mind doing what it always did, mapping patterns, searching for cause and effect, and finding none that fit. One of the figures beyond the threshold shifted, taking a careful step closer, just enough to test the boundary, and nothing stopped them. No visible barrier, no surge of energy, but they stopped anyway, as if something internal had drawn a line they were unwilling to cross. She watched that small motion, the almost step, and there was something like understanding in her expression, not judgment, not approval, just recognition of a pattern repeating itself. "You are not required to be afraid," she said, and the statement did not sound like reassurance. It sounded like a correction, as if fear were an assumption that could be revised. Ethan felt that land in a place he did not expect, somewhere between instinct and thought, and he shifted his weight slightly, grounding himself again in the familiar sensation of boots against metal flooring. The system behind him remained quiet. No alarms, no warnings, just a steady hum that had settled into a new normal. And he realized with a small, almost reluctant clarity that whatever had happened here had not broken the facility. It had changed it. The figure at the doorway lowered their hand, whatever they had been preparing to do forgotten or abandoned, and for a moment the entire corridor seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something louder, something more decisive, something that would fit the scale of what they were witnessing. But nothing came. She did not advance, did not retreat. She simply stood at the threshold, present, undeniable, and the absence of escalation became its own kind of event. Ethan glanced at her, then at the doorway, then back again, and a thought formed slowly, not as a conclusion, but as a realization he could not quite ignore, that this was not about control or release, not about threat or response. It was about something far simpler and far more difficult to process. "You are not showing them power," he said quietly, the words leaving his mouth before he fully examined them. And she turned her head just enough to meet his gaze again, that same calm clarity in her eyes. "No," she replied, And there was a softness there now, something that had not been present before. I am showing them choice. And in the silence that followed, Ethan understood, not completely, not in a way he could explain in a report or a log, but enough to know that whatever came next would not be decided by systems or protocols, but by the people standing just beyond the threshold, and whether they could step forward without being told to. No one moved. And that was the moment Ethan realized how fragile control really was, not when systems failed or alarms sounded, but when people simply chose not to act. The figure at the doorway shifted again, slower this time, as if testing not just the space but their own hesitation, and behind them the others remained still, watching, waiting for someone else to decide what this moment meant. Ethan could feel it in the room, that invisible tension, not sharp or aggressive, but stretched thin, like something held between two possible outcomes. And for once there was no protocol to collapse it into a single direction. She did not press them, did not step forward or demand anything. She simply remained where she was, and somehow that absence of force carried more weight than any command ever could. You were taught to respond, she said quietly, her voice steady, reaching beyond the threshold without rising in volume. To classify, to contain, to correct, and each word seemed to settle into the corridor, into the posture of those listening, as if she were naming something they had never questioned. Ethan glanced at the nearest figure, catching the subtle shift in their stance, the way their shoulders eased just slightly, not in surrender, but in uncertainty, as if the certainty they relied on had been removed without being replaced. But this, she continued, her gaze steady, this requires something else. And she did not finish the sentence, did not define it, leaving the space open in a way that felt deliberate. Ethan felt that openness too, like standing at the edge of a decision that no one else could make for you. And he realized, with a clarity that surprised him, that this was the same moment she had faced in the chamber, the same pause before his hand had moved, the same space where action was not commanded but chosen. The figure at the doorway took another step, small, careful, crossing the threshold by inches, and nothing reacted, no system flared, no force pushed them back, and that absence spoke louder than any warning could have. Ethan watched it happen, the shift from observation to participation, and something in his chest loosened, not relief exactly, but recognition. She turned her head slightly, following the movement, and there was something softer in her expression now, something that looked almost like approval but without judgment, as if she were witnessing a pattern unfold exactly as it needed to. You see, she said, not to Ethan alone, not to the others alone, but to the moment itself. You are not defined by what you were told to do. And the words did not challenge, they invited, and that made them harder to ignore. Ethan let out a slow breath, his eyes moving between her and the person now standing just inside the chamber, close enough to feel the shift in air, close enough to realize that nothing had broken, nothing had attacked, nothing had demanded submission. The facility behind him hummed steadily, systems recalibrated, stable in a way they had not been before, and he realized that the real change was not in the machines, it was in the people, in the space where fear had been expected and something else had taken its place. The person at the threshold lowered their hands completely now, no longer prepared for action, just present, and for a moment, that was enough. Ethan rubbed his thumb against his palm, a small grounding gesture, and looked at her again, really looked this time, not as an anomaly, not as a problem, but as someone who had stood in the same kind of moment he had, someone who had faced the choice between what was expected and what felt right. So what happens if they choose wrong? He asked quietly, because even now, even here, he could not ignore the possibility, and she met his gaze without hesitation, the light in her eyes steady, unwavering. Then they learn, she said, and there was no fear in it, no urgency, just a simple acceptance that felt larger than the room could hold. And for the first time since the alarms had started, Ethan believed that whatever came next would not be decided by force, but by whether anyone was willing to step forward without it. The step inside the chamber did not trigger anything, no surge, no defensive response, just the quiet confirmation that nothing had ever been holding them back except expectation, and Ethan saw it in the way the person at the threshold paused again, not because they were stopped, but because they had crossed something invisible and were not sure what came after. The others behind them shifted, closer now. No longer forming a line of resistance, but something else, something less defined, like a group trying to understand a moment instead of control it. She watched them with that same calm attention, not directing, not guiding, just present in a way that allowed the moment to exist without being forced into shape. "You feel it," she said softly, and it was not a question, more like an acknowledgement, and the person inside the chamber nodded slightly, almost unconsciously, as if they were surprised by their own response. Ethan remained where he was, a few feet off to the side, his hands still, his breathing even, but his mind moving through what he was seeing with a clarity that felt sharper than anything he had experienced before, because there was no data set for this, no model, no prior reference, just observation and the quiet realization that this was not about her at all. "It is not power," she continued, her gaze moving between them. "And it is not control." And the words settled in the space like markers, defining what this was not before ever explaining what it was. Ethan glanced at the nearest console out of habit, half expecting some delayed system reaction, but the display remained steady, parameters holding, as if the facility itself had accepted the new state without resistance. The person who had stepped inside took another step, then another, slow, deliberate, each movement chosen rather than compelled, and the distance between them and her closed to a few feet, close enough now that the shift in light around her was unmistakable, not brighter, not dimmer, just clearer, like the air itself had been cleaned of something that had always been there. "Then what is it?" the person asked, their voice careful, not demanding, not defensive, just honest in a way that surprised even Ethan, and for a moment the entire room seemed to lean into the question. She did not answer immediately, and that pause carried weight, not tension, but space, the kind of space that required someone else to meet it halfway. Ethan felt that pause settle on him too, and before he could fully process why, he found himself speaking, his voice low but steady, filling the silence without breaking it. "It is a choice," he said, the words coming from somewhere deeper than logic, somewhere that had been formed in the moment his hand had hovered over that first override, and she turned to look at him, not surprised, not impressed, just acknowledging that he had stepped into the same space she had been holding. "Yes," she said, and there was something warmer in her tone now, something that felt less distant. "And choice cannot be forced." And the simplicity of it landed harder than any complex explanation could have. The person in front of her lowered their shoulders fully now, tension easing in a way that made them look almost different, less like someone responding to a situation and more like someone present within it. And the others behind them followed, not in unison, not as a command, but as a gradual shift that spread through the corridor. Ethan watched it happen, the pattern changing not because it was directed, but because it was understood, and for the first time since this began, he felt something like certainty, not about the outcome, but about the nature of what was unfolding. "You changed this," he said quietly, not to claim anything, not to assign responsibility, just to name what he saw. And she shook her head slightly, the movement subtle but clear. "No," she replied, her eyes moving from him back to the others. "I revealed what was already there." And as the room settled into that truth, Ethan realized that the most unexpected part of all of it was not that she had been contained, or that she had been released, but that the moment everything changed, no one had needed to be told what to do next. No one announced the end of the moment. It simply settled, like dust after something unseen had shifted, and Ethan felt it in the quiet way the room held itself, not tense, not waiting, just steady. The person standing closest to her did not step back, did not reach for anything. They simply stood there, breathing, present in a way that had not existed when they first arrived, and behind them the others mirrored that stillness, not out of command, but because there was nothing left to react to. The systems around them continued their low, even hum, no longer urgent, no longer corrective, just functioning. And for the first time since the alarms had begun, Ethan realized the facility was no longer trying to solve a problem. It was simply existing alongside something it could not define. She turned slightly, not toward the corridor, not toward the chamber, but toward him, and the shift was small, almost easy to miss. Yet it carried a weight that drew his attention immediately. He met her gaze without thinking, the distance between them unchanged. but the space feeling different now, less like a boundary and more like a connection that had been acknowledged. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and Ethan found that he did not need words to understand what had changed, not in her, not in the others, but in himself, in the simple fact that he was no longer looking for a system to fix. "You chose," she said quietly, and the words were not praise, not judgment, just recognition. And he let out a small breath, almost a laugh, though there was no humor in it. "I did what made sense," he replied, because that was still the only way he knew how to frame it, even now. She considered that, her expression calm, the light beneath her skin steady, and then, slowly, deliberately, she moved. It was not a dramatic gesture, not a display of power, just a single step closer, closing the last bit of distance between them until she stood within arm's reach, and Ethan felt the air shift again, not pressured, not charged, just clear, like standing outside after a long time indoors. The others in the corridor did not interrupt, did not react, they simply watched, and for once, watching was enough. She lowered her gaze for a fraction of a second, and then, without ceremony, without explanation, she bent her knees and lowered herself to the ground in front of him. The motion was slow, intentional, not forced by anything, not compelled by any rule or expectation, and Ethan felt his chest tighten as the meaning of it settled in a place deeper than thought. It was not submission, not reverence in the way stories described. It was something else, something quieter, something that did not elevate him so much as it acknowledged the moment they had shared. He instinctively shifted forward, not to stop her, not to pull her up, but to meet her at that level, his hand lifting slightly before he caught himself, unsure of what the right response even was. "You do not bow to me," he said, the words coming out softer than he expected, because everything about this felt wrong in a way that was also completely right. She looked up at him, her eyes steady, the light within them reflecting something vast and calm, and for the first time, there was something unmistakably human in her expression. "I do not bow to you," she said gently, and the faintest hint of warmth touched her voice. "I acknowledge what you chose to be," and the distinction settled into the space between them, simple, undeniable. Ethan let out a slow breath, his shoulders easing as he lowered his hand again, not needing to fix this, not needing to define it, just allowing it to exist, behind him. The facility continued to hum. The people in the corridor remained still, and the moment held, not as an ending, but as something that would carry forward beyond the walls that had once tried to contain it. And as he stood there, looking down at someone the system had called an asset, someone others might have called a god, Ethan understood something with a clarity that did not need explanation. That power had not changed her, and it had not changed him, but kindness had changed everything.